We met because Jason had a band before this band, and I joined the band for a tour. And we just got along really well. And
I became inseparable. And started writing music.
yeah, I had reached a place where I needed to try to start. I needed a fresh approach, basically. So when Jason offered me the chance to go on tour, I kind of jumped at it. The rest is history.
I think it's just that New York in general is like, it's the cultural capital of America. So anyone who wants to be an artist and is serious about it is probably going to move to New York. And that's why it is what it is. If you have a band in the middle of the country, it's really hard to get people to listen to it. So it ends up being all these really inspired, creative people, but the cost of living in New York is so high that there's this double thing where the people are really competitive just to survive, but they're also really competitive because everyone else is having to work at that same level. And so the art I think gets better and better around you. So the fun thing is having friends who are also putting out records all the time and going on tour and checking out what they're working on, and it just drives you. So you're not in a little bubble.
I mean, it's a little strange being home. It's not like we don't see all those other bands all the time. It's funny, we will see them out on the road sometimes more than when we're at home. Or like the other week, we showed up to one venue and our neighbors, Holy Ghost, who live literally next door to us, were playing the night before us, or the night after or something. And then we went somewhere else, and it was another Brooklyn band that was playing, the same venue the next week or something like that. And I think there's just a lot of energy there, and in Williamsburg specifically, which is what people mean when they talk about Brooklyn, usually, there's a whole kind of network set up for bands. There are recording studios and practice spaces and venues and producers and all that stuff.
Which is all
a bunch of people
stuff
around that want to work with you on things. So.
It's all stuff that really wasn't in New York when I first moved there. And at that time, people weren't really living in Williamsburg. So it was, in Manhattan, it's a lot more congestion, and there isn't anywhere to practice. And so it was something that kind of like just sort of slowly started to happen. All these creative people were moving to the city, and then at the same time, people were pushing out into Williamsburg, which is it's like pretty much the East Village. It's just right across the river. It's one subway stop, and it has much bigger warehouse spaces, and so just this whole little kind of community grew up around it. But we're not really so in love with the neighborhood. It's a pretty ugly neighborhood, to be honest with you. Especially where our street is kind of hideous. It's a gas station, and it doesn't have like that kind of movie set New York look to it. It looks like it could be anywhere. But it's cheap, so. It's different, like I lived in Berlin for a year and a half when I was working on that other band, and there's like a really intense creative inspiration that happens in this city as well, but I feel like it's much more individualized. It's like you have to make that experience happen for you on your own. But there's no like bands here, there's no one to like really bounce ideas off of, and you don't really have to work very hard. And everyone's got fantastic, huge apartments and has all the time in the world. So I just felt like the level of like challenge is really low. You don't have to try very hard to have your friends applaud you here. But if you,
that was your experience, yeah.
I mean, there's lots of great things that come out of this town, but I think it's always someone who's just like, I'm going to do this on my own, and they make it happen for themselves. At the time, it was. I mean, I lived all over, but at the time I mostly hung out at Octomillimeter. My friends owned that place, so that was kind of I was working in a studio up the street, so I would go there after recording. And I liked that. I liked having this little I would go from the studio and I would play with whatever I was working on before people really started showing up in the bar, early in the evening. So.
Right around the same time, my sister was living in Prenzlauer Berg, and she was like maybe 2 blocks away from Octomillimeter, so she went down there and knew all the same people as well. So, but I guess no one hangs out down there anymore.
It's always, I mean, because I didn't leave at all when I was here for that year and a half, and I don't really speak German, so it's like this kind of weird dreamy feeling because everything looks familiar, and it's the only city that I have that association with that I had lived in any other time, because I've basically been in New York the rest of the time. So it feels really weirdly familiar instantly. Dresden, which was the first thing that we did together. And it was this, I had been a walking tour guide, an English language walking tour guide in Berlin.
It was the first song we wrote as a band. So Jason had moved back from Berlin maybe a year before, or
Yeah, about a year.
So that whole experience was still really fresh in his mind, and kind of because of him, and because he had learned so much, being a walking tour guide, learned so much history, Berlin history, and a lot of that has to do with World War II, obviously. We were both obsessed with World War II history at the time, and we're kind of reading books and watching films and all that stuff. So it was something that came out of stories that we kept reading about and hearing from the cities in Germany at the time.
But it's kind of like a double exposure between the actual historical thing, which was what you're talking about, like the teenagers in Berlin in the bunkers were afraid when the Russians were going to get there, so they were trying to lose their virginity before that. Like double exposed with like kids in nightclubs now, which kind of looks like it's like dark and it's bunkers.
They're in the basement, it's dark, and
which
weird
also
lights are flashing.
is like kind of part of my Berlin experience as well. It's like that whole world of like you just lose yourself in this like weird kind of night, especially in the wintertime when it's so dark, you know, and people are hooking up in these like really, you know, because it's where that stuff happened. It's like everything kind of looks a little bit war torn, really did then, you know. So that was kind of the jumping off of the song. It's like someone is sort of in both places at the same time. There's a lot of like similar kinds of things. There's a lot of like little bits of history that pop up here and there, but not necessarily like, it's not a history lesson, so we're not trying to, it's not necessarily on the surface of the song. And there's a lot of like war-torn type things. There's a lot about cities, kind of.
I think living in a city, you always, like, in the back of your mind, you always wonder what would happen if the city, if it became a war city, and what the history of that is. And so those ideas were kind of coming back over and over again. But really, we wanted to just write, love songs. A lot of them are really just love songs, but maybe the character is some kid who's screwed up and living in the city and doesn't know how they feel about relationships or sex or whatever it is. So.
A lot of ideas borrowed from films and stuff too. And most of the time we do that. It's like the song, the surface level of the song is just a simple song, like I was talking about. But then there's always like games for ourselves inside the text that just kind of like